Good morning, everybody. It's me, Lori Simpson Ortega, a host of a Victorious Life Outreach Teaching Ministries located here in the beautiful city of Roses, Tyler, Texas. As always, we wanted to say thank you for joining us. Today, the Sunday school lesson will be coming from Matthew chapters 1 and 2. And I want to say, normally I would be broadcasting, I think, at 7 to 8, but I have a Civitan meeting this morning from 8 to 9. We believe in doing our civic duty and giving back to the community that we live in by way of service. So I'm broadcasting early, and I didn't want to do a pre-video because I didn't have time to do that. So the lesson for today is coming from Matthew chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. So parts of chapter 1 and then parts of chapter 2. And I want to say this, on last Sunday we were in Luke chapter 2, I believe. Yeah, we did Luke chapter 2, where we presented Luke's version of the birth of Christ. And do you remember last week I said that the Gospels tell the same story, but they are written from different perspectives. So last week, Luke, being the equivalent to, again, a nurse practitioner or even a PA, a physician's assistant in modern times, his was very to the point. He was his writing was very fact based, just like we said, just the facts, nothing more. So, what we're going to see today in the book of Matthew, Matthew is a more descriptive writer. I'm under the personal impression that maybe Matthew was the it's not Parliament. He was possibly the historian, because of the way that he writes in such detail, and he puts in sometimes a lot of little bits that the other writers, such as Luke, did not. So we're going to go ahead and get into this verse. And as soon as I said that, I had to yawn because I looked at the time. It's like 5:13. All righty. Now, in Matthew chapter 1, from verses 1 through 17, and I better get my cell phone again because the Bible that I selected is not working with my AARP eyes at this moment. So I'm going to read it on here if that is okay with you guys, which I'm sure it is. So the birth of Jesus, Matthew chapter 1. I want you to notice that from Matthew chapter 1 all the way down to Matthew to verse from 1 to verse 14, you will see that it basically gives just a genealogy. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the genealogy, a genealogy is just a record, a family's record of the births and lineages for that family. And I think it is important. Now, I'm not going to read I'm not going to read those 14 verses, but I do encourage you to read those verses. Well, I will read verse 1 and verse number 5, because in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." What is interesting about that is the way that it is presented. In the Old Testament, they always started with the first and then they went to the last. So in this particular case, they are starting, and Matthew starts with Jesus as the lead in, letting you know that his book is not going to be about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David. It's not going to be about that. So that is important because it starts with Jesus at the beginning. And then when you get down to verse number 16, it ends with him from within that lineage. So it starts out, the New Testament, ironically, starts out with a revolutionary way of presenting family history. Instead of it starting out with Abraham, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and Moses, it doesn't start out like that. It just starts out with Jesus, a generation of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And the reason it does that is because the reason it references David is because it was a fulfillment. The arrival and the birth of, you would just say the arrival of Jesus was a fulfillment of prophecy to David in the Old Testament when the Lord told him, your seed, you will never leave the throne. So this is the fulfillment of the promises that God made to David. So that's why his name appears. Abraham appears because he was the first person that God basically created not only a nation from, but also a lineage, an earthly and a spiritual lineage. So that's why those men are in there, those two. But when you look at verse number 5, it says, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rachab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king, and so on, so on. Now, the reason I put that in there is because when you go back in your personal studies, go back and I want you to read the story of Ruth. Now, the reason I reference Ruth, believe it or not, it all ties into the Christmas story. But the reason I reference Ruth is because Ruth was non Hebrew, non Israelite. Ruth was a Moabitess. And unfortunately, anybody in the Bible with an "ite" at the end of their, as their ethnic identity, um, was regarded as an enemy. Okay, now I have my theories on that, and I'm just going to be real transparent. Um, that kind of rubs me, sometimes that rubs me the wrong way. Again, I'm just being transparent because, yeah, and I don't have the time to go into that part. But Ruth was a Moabitess. She married Obed. Now, when you understand the story of Ruth, then you understand that Ruth's mother in law was a woman by the name of Naomi. And Naomi and her husband left their land, left their place of residence, and they moved to another location. They took their sons and they moved them to another location. So they were Hebrews, they were Jewish, they were Israelite, whatever. But when they moved to their new location, her husband died. And her son, well, her husband, they set up a life there. And both of her sons married Moabite women. So both of her sons, well, first of all, her husband, they broke they broke the covenant by moving to a different location. And her sons further broke the covenant by marrying basically outside of their races, because the goal in those days was to keep the bloodlines pure. So their two sons married two Moabite women. Well, after so many years, the Bible doesn't let us know, but both of the sons died, and they left the mother-in-law, and the father died. So all of the males in her home died, and it left Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Those two women were not genetically linked to Naomi. They came from two totally different lifestyles, backgrounds, and neither of them had children. So when they left, when Naomi decided to go back home to her people, basically to try to restore the covenant and regain her inheritance, she gave both of those women the option. She basically said, "There's nothing I can do for you. Your loyalty to me, you were only contracted to me through marriage." So Ruth decided to go with Naomi. And because Ruth went with Naomi, she ended up marrying Naomi's kinsman, okay, Boaz. And she was only able, that was the only way that if Naomi wanted her property back, she had to be redeemed or restored back to her family. And she was restored back to her family through Ruth, who married Boaz, who was kin to Naomi. Now, the reason that is significant is because, again, Ruth was considered a Gentile. So here in the lineage of Jesus, you read where Boaz married Ruth, and they had Obed, and Obed had Jesse, who was the father of David, King David. So you see how even in the line of Jesus, there has always been a provision for everybody. To like Paul said, and all those other to the Greek is Peter. It's to the Greek. It's to the non-Greek. It's to the Jew. To the non-Jew. It's to the Turkish and the Iranian. It's to salvation through Jesus Christ is to everybody. So I did want to point those two verses out to let you know that from within this lineage, you're going to discover a myriad of imperfect people. It's basically like Jesus was born at Beto, okay? And I know that sounds carnal, but you have all elements of 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 I don't know, I want to say dysfunction, but it's just in his line. If you did the research for each of these people, they were not perfect people. They were all, you got some adulterers in here, you got some murderers in here, you got some blasphemers, you got some idolaters in his line. What do you think? Solomon, even though David was an adulterer and a murderer, Solomon, he was smart, but he turned out to be a little, had deviant behavior, and was an idolater on a grand scale. Okay, been married all these women. That means he was probably sexually deviant, and had sexual issues. So you see what you're going to discover if you take the time to read about each of those people, what you're going to see in the line of Jesus, that you had all these imperfect people that basically in his line addressed every single issue that humanity uh, has faced. You had good people, but it's kind of like our families. We always have a couple people, they don't want to act right. They don't want to do right. They don't want to be right. You got a couple, in every family, you have people who have issues. So I wanted to point that out. So then when we get down to verse number 16, it says, "And Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary." Now, this is not the Jacob from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was a common name, kind of like David, Bobby, Mike, etc. So it was a common name. And so Joseph, the son of Jacob, as it says, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, I do want to point this out. Notice it did not say Joseph who begat Jesus. It did not say that. It just gave Joseph credit for being the earthly surrogate father, i.e., stepdad, heaven appointed father figure. It gave credit for that. And it says, yeah, I wanted to make this, it says the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. So it does give, it shows him, um, it gives him some, I'm not gonna say credit, but it establishes the fact that there was a family pattern. There was a nuclear, Jesus came from a nuclear family place. All right. So then when we get to verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So the reason when it says when it speaks in 14 generations, you have to understand biblical numerology. And I'm not saying biblical numerology like astrology and all that, but while numbers don't matter to God, he makes numbers work. And I want you to remember that when you're going through your struggles. He makes numbers work. Numbers don't matter. He makes them work regardless. So, but in the Bible, certain numbers come with certain um, certain insinuendos, if that's the word I can use. They come in, or excuse me, certain numbers um, in the Bible come with certain meanings. Now, to the church, unchurched, and non-churched, um, you know that we know we are used to certain numbers. The number three, Trinity, representing the triune God. God is Father, Son, and Spirit. Number five, grace and favor. Number seven, completion. Number 10, government. Number eight, new beginning. So 12, organization. So we understand when you start reading the Bible, you will understand what the major number patterns are. The number 40 is always associated with a time of renewal and through struggle, through, it's, and I know some of you Bible scholars that are watching this isn't to you, so don't inbox me about all this additional stuff. Thou carest not. Um, the number 40 is significant to, the 40 days of trying. It's a time period in which your faith is tested and you are basically sharpened from within your negative, what you perceive to be a negative situation. So, like the 40 years that they were wandering around in the wilderness, the 40 days and the 40 nights for the flood, the 40 days that Jesus was fasting and praying, etc. So, the number 14 represents salvation, deliverance, and divine protection. So, what I want you to know about that is it's set up, what you see are numerical patterns that are transitioning from the Old Testament, and those same numerical patterns are transitioning into the New Testament. So, good morning, Marcus. So that is why you see it says the 14. So, and it's broken down into different intervals. Now, verse number 16 reads, Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Espoused means engaged. Now, I want to chase this rabbit for a minute. When it says that she was espoused or engaged to Joseph, I do want the viewing audience to know this was not like a love marriage. Okay, this wasn't set up at the beginning. This was not set up this way. It was set up as an arranged marriage because, unfortunately, as women, we were considered property. As daughters, as wives, we were property. Okay, and our only, back then, and some people are proving that to be, seems like even now, but we were property. So our primary goal, or forget it, was to get married, to raise kids, and to help our husbands and spouses. Okay. So when it says that she was engaged to him, they had her parents, probably her father and probably paid a dowry for her to marry Joseph. So it was more like a business transaction. Now, I do believe that he loved her and he cared for her, but it was not the way. They did not have the freedom. Women didn't have the freedom, to date, to get to know their future spouses. They didn't have that opportunity. So she was engaged to him. Now, here's something that we do have to address: the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that 9 times out of 10, Joseph could have been anywhere from 10 to 15 years older than Mary. It's not like you see on television that she was, she 19, he 20. No, it probably wasn't like that. She was more than likely. We know that in order for her to be considered a woman or of marrying age, she had to have went through, the menstrual cycle, and that process had to have started in order for her to have kids. So more than likely, Mary was anywhere from the age of 13 to about 15 or 16. And I know we find that horrible in our current society, but that is, excuse me, that is still the norm in some other countries. And that was the norm here in the United States until maybe around the 50s or the 60s. You had not arranged marriages, but you had girls who were getting married 15, 16 to 21, 22-year-old men. And that was, well, that's horrible. Now, the maturity levels were different back then. So, because I'm sure many of our grandmothers married men who were 5 or 6 years older than they were, and maybe 10 years, because the maturity level was different. It's not like it was now, which we totally do not agree with: a 15-year-old marrying a 21 or 25-year-old. So he was engaged to her, but before they got married and consummated their marriage or came together and did what married people do, she was expecting. But you notice it says with child of the Holy Ghost. Okay, verse number 19. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privately. Now, when that was made known to Joseph, it could not have been made known to Joseph until she started showing signs. Somebody had to see, wait a minute, that's not normal bloating. That's, wait a minute, perfectly round, sitting kind of low. Okay, they were probably saying Joseph has been sticking his hand in the cookie jar. All right. So when he found this out, either through her or somebody else telling him, um, when it says he was a just man, that means he was caring. He always sought to do the right thing. So he didn't want to put her away. He didn't want to make a public example of her, because technically, if it wasn't his, she could have been stoned, because they were still, adultery was to them like one of the absolute worst sins next to blasphemy during the time of Jesus. It was blasphemy and adultery. You could murder somebody, but okay, well, what were the circumstances? So he didn't want her to face that consequence. So when it said that he wanted to put her away privately, that means that he wanted to pay for her to go somewhere else and to start her life over. But here's what I want you to think about. In the trying to put her away privately, he would not have been able to put away the stigma or the stain that would have been attached to her family. And sometimes we don't always think about that. We don't think about the fact that here this woman is, excuse me, this young girl is expecting a baby, and her parents are like, because we don't read in here what the Lord told her parents, this the child of the Most High. We don't read in here where he said that to her parents. So, can you imagine the public humiliation and the public embarrassment that her parents were facing because she had gone against the traditional values that they were all, living by and held to? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the whispers of the neighbors and the city? Can you imagine the alienation and the unnecessary counsel and comments that her parents had to endure, all the while she's telling them, no, I have not been with anybody, no, I haven't been. Can you imagine that? So that is what Joseph, when it says that he was going to have to put her away, he was going to put her away privately. I want you to understand, he would not have been able to do that just for her, because even though again he removed Mary, he could not have removed the stigma and the dark spot that would have been left for her family to navigate through. And that would have been, back in the day, if you had a kid, you had a child out of what they call wedlock, you couldn't work those jobs. You really couldn't. People would hold the parents accountable. So when I want you to think about that, he would not have just been able to isolate or alienate her from from that situation. Um, he would have to do something small but big. Um, but look at what verse 20. But while he thought on these things, while he figured out how he was going to do that, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Now, this is when I want to say it is very important for you to understand that Joseph had to be a highly spiritual man. Joseph had to know how to discern and recognize the voice of the Lord. So while he's trying to figure out how he's going to walk away from the situation with maintaining his dignity, because we didn't even talk about, can you imagine when people found out, they're looking at him, man, you knocked somebody's daughter up, you impregnated somebody's daughter. Can you imagine all of the hostility and the snickers and the whispers that he too was facing because of that? Now, uh, if men back then, people typically believed the male more than they believed the woman. Yeah, I apologize. So he was at an advantage from that standpoint, but this lets you know he was a spiritual man, that he believed and listened to and could recognize the voice of the Lord. So the voice of the Lord, uh, uh, this is angel of the Lord, and I have my theory as to that angel of the Lord. And so the angel of the Lord comes to Joseph and he tells him, hey, you do this. This is what's going on. She's still a good person. She's still, don't let the external side of what you see sway you from, or sway or stop you from doing what you know is something that you should do. This also lets you know that while he was thinking of ways to put her away privately, you know that he cared for her. Okay, so you know that he cared for her and that he cared about her. But I also want you, non church, unchurched, and church hurt, to do some research on how marriages were conducted back then and engagements. And I think it will shed a lot of light. So they did have time to have conversations, monitored conversations, um, through family events and dinners, but it wasn't like like Hollywood portrays it. They were on weekend excursions and getaways, and they were walking holding hands and kissing under palm trees. It was not like that at all. It was always monitored supervision, and it was usually in some type of family setting. So the angel of the Lord goes to Joseph, and he tells him, hey, basically the same thing he tells Mary. Look at what he says, and she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Okay, he said that to Mary when this, the spirit is going to overtake you and all that kind of stuff. Now, all this was done again that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin shall be with child and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is interpreted God with us. Okay. So I think that's pretty much self-explanatory. 24 and 25. Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife. So they got married. There was no fanfare. There was no large bridal party. There was no stealing of the wife away or the groom away. It was low key. So they got married, and he knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. That means he did not have any intimate relations with Mary until after Jesus was born. Now, here's what you need to know. After they got married, and the Bible doesn't give you this intelligence, but understanding how things work from a natural standpoint during that time, after they got married, Joseph pretty much had to be low key. They still had to endure the chitter chatter and the whispers of, oh yeah, that's why they didn't even have a wedding. They didn't even get to, he didn't that. So think about that, because a lot of times when we read these stories, we want to glamorize them and we forget the human side of them. We forget that life had to still go on. We forget that sometimes as believers in Christ, we will be faced with a lot of negative situations and things that we did not create on our own, but we will have to navigate through them. And you got to navigate through chitter chatter and whispers and untruths, mistruths, partial truths. You have to navigate through those things. And Mary and Joseph are two, I think, of two perfect examples of how you do that with grace and with dignity. So that is the story of his parents. So last week we talked about his birth, but then and the location for his birth. And now this week we were talking, gave you some limited insight into his parents. I suggest in your personal Bible study time that you do the research for yourself and you read the verses for yourself. I read the KJV Bible, so yeah. Now let's get to the really good part, which is Matthew chapter 2, the wise men from the east, or the Magi. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. I want to press pause and say this. It reads Bethlehem. Bethlehem was the city, Judea was the province. Okay, because remember, they are still under Roman control and Roman domination. So when you start to read the scriptures, especially the New Testament, from Matthew to John, yeah, you see me do it, Matthew more. You start reading Matthew to John, you're going to hear towns like Bethlehem, Nazareth, Judea, Galilee, Samaria, Lake Gennesaret. You're going to hear things along those lines, cities and towns along those lines. And I want you to remember that Jesus was a small city preacher. He was not a Dallas, Houston, Austin, preacher. He was a Lindell Bullard, uh, Lindell Bullard, uh, Troop. He was a small city preacher. And what he did was this, he followed the same pattern as the men of God, the Elijah and Elijah in the Old Testament. He had a route. The only time Jesus went into Jerusalem, the big city, was for holy days, feast days, and to be punished. Okay, he was not preaching in the temple. Jesus preached in the temple that time to say, "Hey, this is what I'm gonna do. This is why I'm here." And then he came back for a feast or a holy day, reverence a feast and holy day. He had to whip them out the temple. And then the next time we read about Jesus showing up, he was somewhere in the sidebar being beaten and scorned and prepped for the cross. Okay. So that is important for you to know early on, that when you hear those certain words, that was his route. So if my fist represents the circle that Jesus performed miracles in his ministry for those 3 years, then my hand will represent what the disciples who later go on to be apostles did. They were the ones who started branching out from the home base or the home location. So that's very important that I say to you that Bethlehem was uh, a city, and Judea was the province that it was broken into provinces because the Romans had domination and control. So from within Judea, you had Bethlehem, you had Nazareth, you had some of the other things. So, and it references the king during that time, the King Herod. Please do a quick research on Herod. Horrible, horrible person. Um, Mental illness, family dysfunction, etc. That sounds okay. Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. So these wise men that we refer to as Magi, they came to Jerusalem specifically saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." Now, this is important because nobody sought them out. And contrary to popular belief, there were not just three wise men. 9 times out of 10, there was a caravan of wise men. There could have been anywhere from 25 to about 50 or more wise men. The only reason we say the three wise men is because when the scriptures were written, they were based on the three gifts. But when you study history, they were the educated people. They were the learned men. They were the people, the men who, like in the Old Testament, in the book of, I think, Second Chronicles, where it says they were to know, there was a tribe called Issachar, and it said they were to know what Israel was to do. So these were non-Jewish people, okay? They were just men of academics. And when it says they were wise men, they were given the label of wise because they studied astrology, not Scorpio, Virgo, Sagittarius, but they studied the patterns in the skies. They to help them understand seasons, when to plant, when not to plant. A modern day example is they were like the almanacs of their time. They knew about weather, they knew about science, they knew about languages, they knew about cultures. They were basically mobile universities. Okay, and they had specific places where they could go and study. But this is very this is the irony in this, is that they left their location because they were responsible for training other people to then go into those provinces. So a lot of times they were like the equivalent to the medical schools, the law schools, that people would go there, and they were like the faculty of that, if I can say. They were like the faculty of great universities, if that, where they were the Harvards and the Yales of their day, the Stanfords of their day. So what is interesting is they left their location and they headed east because they had been studying the not just the prophecies for this, but they had been studying different cultures, and we know that they had gained high status because they were able to be presented to Herod the king. It wasn't like they were just running out here, we want to see the king. It was not set up that way. They had to have been held in high esteem in order for them to get an audience with the king. And the one thing there are three things in verse number 2 that they said that triggered something in Herod. First of all, they asked, "Where is the new king of the Jews?" Okay. They asked for the new king. Okay. And then they said, "We've seen his star and we've come to worship him." Those three things alone were enough to trigger the insecurities in Herod. First of all, why? Because Herod was the king at that time. And because Herod had no star, there were no prophecies about him among his own people. And nobody was there willingly worshiping him. Herod was hated and disliked by not only the Roman, not only the Jewish people, but the Roman people were constantly plotting from within the governmental structure. And let me say this about history, that is why Rome fell. Rome imploded from the inside. It didn't explode, it imploded. It didn't last because there were too many inner uh, governmental conflicts, and it got too big to where they were trying to regulate a bunch of stuff and derate. So we see a lot of that taking place now. But so those were the things that triggered something in him. And look what he said: when Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Okay, the reason he was troubled is because, again, he felt like it was a threat to his leadership. And because he felt like it was a threat to his leadership, he couldn't sleep. He wanted to find him because that's all he thought about. Or that's how he thought. How he thought was basically about how to stay in power and how to knock out threats. And I want to use this time to say this with Herod is a pattern of behavior that you will see that runs throughout the Bible when it comes to leadership. Herod, if he was a violent, mentally ill, aggressive, unstable, ill prepared leader, then the Jews were troubled because when Herod was troubled, nobody had any peace. Nobody had any rest. He would decide, well, let's just kill them all. And with the stroke of a pen, it's kind of like what we see, not just taking place today, but throughout government in our time around the world. If the leader is calm, peaceful, thoughtful, then the people are going to be calm, peaceful, thoughtful. If the leader is angry, aggressive, bitter, foul-mouthed, ill-tempered, arrogant, then that whatever spirit is resting on the leader is going to be manifested not only in him or her as the leader, but also in the subjects that he or she rules. And that, so and that's what happened here when it says that he was troubled. He was troubled, and the Jewish people knew that they in turn was about to be on the receiving end of that trouble. Kind of like when people, unfortunately, people of color, whenever we have leadership, and I am speaking on behalf of all the people of color. Whenever there's a change in leadership, and if the leadership is not respected of people of color, and then people of color, such as myself, we suffer because the people around us who may be the same color of the presidents or the leaders, they feel they can they themselves can take certain liberties, and they start to feel empowered. And that's why the Jews were afraid, because if Herod was troubled, Herod, the people around Herod would then be put in a situation where they had to be troubled, and then somebody had to be made an example of. And then the people around them, not the people in the government, but the local people that they were interacting with, would then start taking on those same character traits and would start persecuting them unnecessarily. They would be more emboldened to hop in faces, more emboldened to start lynching and hitting and killing and lying on and trying to institutionalize innocent people. So that's why they were troubled. Herod was only troubled because he felt a threat to his through his power source and his leadership. But look at what happened. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And so it begins. So notice, after the wise men said something to him, he was so worried that he went and he grabbed every church leader, every synagogue door holder, and he asked them, hey, where is this person? Why didn't y'all tell me about this? Y'all tell me about everything else. Why didn't you tell me y'all had a new king? Why didn't you tell me somebody had been born that's going to rule y'all? Why didn't y'all tell me that y'all had been basically grooming, hiding and grooming a separate king independent of Rome? I'm sure that's how that conversation went. But look at what it said. He demanded of them where Christ should be born. He wanted to know, where is this king? Where is this child? Now, here's a point I want to make to the non-church, the unchurched, and the church hurt. God can, sometimes the message doesn't always come to the church first. And I know I'm going to get some flack about that from the church people. But here's a perfect example of the non-church, the unchurched came to the other non-church unchurched, and they delivered a message to the church that was clueless, because God had ordained it to be so. Now they were wise, and the meaning the church leaders, they knew about the prophecy, they knew about it, but apparently nobody had been staying on top of it. They had just been praying. They had just been hoping. They had just been believing. They had just been chitter chattering about the verses. Okay. Sometimes God will use unchurched, non-church, and church hurt people to relay and convey a message of hope to you, to provide you with some information that you need. Sometimes a church person, God will purposefully put a person, an active church or church member, into your life to convey a profound spiritual message that will help you to be better, do better, become better. So he demanded of them. Oh, I'm sure Herod went off. Verse number 5, and they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. They had no clue that Jesus had actually been born. They simply requoted the scriptures. They repeated and revealed the prophecy. And look at what they did. These are now the church people. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. So they're quoting the prophetic verses of the Old Testament to Herod. They're not thinking anything about we need to find a baby. They're not thinking anything about that, because Herod also, the Bible doesn't include this information, but you know that the wise men had to be somewhere around. A representative of the wise men had to be there to say, well, this is why we showed up. How do y'all know? How, why don't you guys know that this is what has happened if that's what you say you believe in? So then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. So he's spoken to the wise men. The wise men have shown up and alerted him. He's grabbed the church people, and the church people are quoting scriptures, no clue as to this is what's happening. And he grabs the wise men again and he's asked them, well, when did this star show up? Because he's trying to figure out the time frame. He's trying to figure out, okay, so when was this? 2 months ago, 3 months ago? What, two nights ago? When was this? When exactly was it? So he was trying to switch and connive because he wanted, he was going to kill Jesus. Bottom line, he was going to kill him, and if he didn't kill him, he would bring him in for a little while to make a spectacle, and then he would kill him. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. Really, no explanation needed for that. When they heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them. Now, isn't that funny that Herod had to ask them when the star appeared? So he didn't see it. Nobody else saw it. Um, and you know that he had to then have people, his learned academic scientists, meteorologists, or whatever, he then had to have them looking, but they didn't see it as well. It was a divine star. It was a star that was for guidance, not illumination for just light, but it was leading them into and to and through spiritual light through the star. So they saw when they got ready to leave, there's that star again. And good morning, Joy. There's that star again, and it's leading them where they needed to be till it came and stood over where the child was born. So it led them in the direction and it led them to the location. And that is going to be part of the ministry of Jesus. Whenever you read from, when he starts his ministry, you're going to location, location and the leading of it's, you're going to see how a lot of people that the Bible recorded as him healing, you're going to see how they were led or they were drawn to him, and they left their location in order to get to him. So when they were there, they showed up and the star led them exactly where they needed to go. And there was Jesus. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Now, that probably should have been written, that sentence probably should have been put at the beginning of their or when they got ready to leave. But they saw the star, and the star was a confirmation that they were in the right place and the right location. Now, here is where, with my last few minutes, we look at verses 11 through verse 12, because these have become symbolic of Christmas. The gifts of the wise men or the Magi. And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down. Now, I want you to notice it didn't say they were in the stable, they were in the manger. No, by this time, Jesus, he's not a baby. By this time, biblical theologians and historians have said by the time this story takes place, Jesus could be anywhere from the age of 2 to about 5. He was no longer a baby. He was quite possibly a toddler. So we'll just say he was a toddler. He was a toddler. They were no longer in the stable. He was no longer laying in a manger. All right. They saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshiped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts. So the wise men follow the star. The star leads them to the location of Jesus. And lo and behold, when they are given permission to enter, now I want you to notice they had to have told Joseph why they were there, specifically why they were there. And when they came in, notice the first thing they immediately fell down and they worshiped him. You don't read where when they went to Herod, they fell down and worshiped Herod. They had no loyalty to Herod. They had no connection to him. But the presence of the Lord, I believe they felt the presence of the Lord in that place. I think they felt the presence of God in that home enough for them to realize this is no ordinary child. This is not an ordinary situation. And notice what I read, when they opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts. Now, here's what I want to clarify in the description that I put. I put gifts to him and his parents. Jesus, as a toddler, could spend no money nowhere. Jesus could not maintain himself at 2 years old. So the gifts that they were presenting to him would still be under the care of his parents, mainly Joseph. I also want you to know that the presenting of gifts serves two significant things. The first thing that the gift, in no particular order, but I'm just going to use the natural one first. The first thing that the gifts represent is life and livelihood in the sustaining of life for the parents. These were not wealthy people. These were average, everyday. Joseph was a carpenter. Carpentry was not like it is now. So he was basically a blue collar worker. So in the presentation of these types of gifts from a natural standpoint, they would be gifts that could be sold for different items to get money. They were like a nest egg to care for Jesus, to help Joseph during the lean time of the business. They could for travel. So from a natural standpoint, the gifts that they presented were for the parents to sustain their life, their livelihood, meaning maintain food, clothing, shelter, etc. But from a spiritual standpoint, when we look at the types of gifts that were presented, we know that these gifts are more representative of spiritual and prophetic implications. And when they opened their treasures, they presented unto him, again, gifts. A gift means you don't have to repay it. It is yours. And I like the phrasing of how Matthew wrote it, because it said they presented. So not only were they presents and gifts, but they were presented. They were given to the parents and to Jesus with a high level of respect. It wasn't like, well, we brought y'all this out here, we can go get you. No, it wasn't like that. They were presented to them. And the only time you read the word presented in the Bible is when you are talking about royalty and giving of things to people who are in authority. So I like how he wrote that they were presented. They presented the gift. Not only did they worship, they then presented, and they were giving something that where there were no strings attached, there were no hitches, no glitches, none of that. And the first thing that they gave him was gold. This is significant because gold is still in 2024, even though this was thousands of years ago, gold is still the universal, it's universal. Everybody understands its value. Gold is extremely valuable. You know, again, it's universal. So we know that just based from a spiritual implication, the first gift they presented was something that was universal, something that's of a high value, a high price. So you know that from a spiritual perspective, Jesus, the message, the call, his ministry is universal. It's for everybody. It's not just for his own. It would be for everybody. And because gold is expensive, he would pay the highest price in order for salvation to be universal. So that's the significance of gold. Then it says frankincense. Now, frankincense was the equivalent to a perfume, okay, an expensive uh, yeah, an expensive perfume, but the frankincense oil, it's the oil that was used. You know, it comes from basically a tree sap. It's like a I'm going to read what it is. It's like a hardened gum-like material that comes from the trunk of the boswellia tree. People use its oil on the skin and in aromatherapy. Frankincense oil seems to kill some types of bacteria and fungi and is commonly used as a fragrance in soaps, lotions, and perfume. So they presented him with frankincense. Well, what's the significance of frankincense? Frankincense is something that his parents, they would be able to sell those, because the myrrh and the frankincense, they would be able to sell it whenever they needed money. Now, when I read the description as to what it would be used for, it is used, like they said, it back in the day, you could use it for fungus, and like I said, like as a topical, for topical use. You couldn't ingest it, you couldn't eat it, but like if you had a cut or a sore, you could rub the oil of it on there, and it acted as a antiseptic, a germ killer. So when you see that they presented him with frankincense, it served a double meaning. The first thing, from a natural standpoint, they could sell anytime they needed. Like in the Old Testament, when the prophet told the lady, "Hey, go sell. What do you have in your house?" She says, "Oil." He said, "Go sell it," because oil was a commodity. So frankincense, if they ran out of money or they needed to pad their nest egg, they could sell, a little bit of the frankincense. So from a natural standpoint, it was for the sustaining, again, and the maintaining of their livelihood. But from a spiritual standpoint, they presented him with something that was unique to his death. Okay, it was unique, frankincense and myrrh. Let me go ahead and tell you about myrrh. Myrrh is an oil, or like it can be an oil or a spice. When I say a spice, it's not like they're using it to cook with. It's almost like potpourri. When somebody dies, they they rub the body with frankincense and myrrh. I don't know what they rub it with now. I'm pretty sure it's the same thing. But back in the ancient world, they rubbed those dead bodies with frankincense and myrrh to fight off it decomposing, or as the body decomposed, it wouldn't have as foul of an odor. So when they presented him with these gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I want you to know that these were gifts that spoke prophetically, not to his birth, but they spoke prophetically to his life. Because you remember last week we talked about swaddling clothes. So this week we're talking about I'm going to finish up with the gifts that they presented, and being warned, the final verse in chapter 2, and being uh, not for today, and being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. So the wise men realizing, wait a minute, through a dream, Herod, don't go back. If you go back to Herod, that's going to be, they went to their own country. So that means that when it says they went to their own country, they did not go back. They did not return back to wherever they were. They basically dispersed. And you know what? We don't read about the wise men anymore in the scriptures. They serve their purpose. So I wanted you to know, while you are putting up your nativity sets, I wanted you to understand the significance of the little figurines being represented in the nativity sets, and I also wanted you to understand the significance of the gifts. Well, that was our Sunday school lesson for today, December 15th, 2024. And as I always say, if you have Christ, you're already a winner. If you have the Spirit of the living God, you can face any challenge life throws your way. Be sure to check us out later between 3:30, 4 o'clock for our Sunday Bible study as well. And we'll see you then. God bless.